China Global Television Network.
The just concluded FOCAC summit in Beijing will go down as one that took relations between China and Africa to a whole new level. Chinese President Xi Jinping used the opportunity to announce a raft of initiatives that will not only further cement ties between China and Africa, but also deepen China's commitment to working with the continent to end poverty and increase development. CGTN's Deji Badmus takes a look at some of the outcomes of the summit.
If there was one summit African leaders looked up to help engender rapid development on the continent, it was this FOCAC summit, and it didn't disappoint. China had since after the last summit in South Africa pledged to deepen its commitments to the continent, and President Xi Jinping wasted no time in unfolding the new package during his opening speech at the summit.
It will include $15 billion in free aid, interest-free loans and concessional loans, $20 billion in credit funds, $10 billion in China-Africa developmental financing, $5 billion in special funds for import trade from Africa, and no less than $10 billion in investment from Chinese companies over the next 3 years.
The $60 billion funding pledge is a renewal of a similar pledge President Xi made at the FOCAC summit in South Africa 3 years ago. It brings China's total commitment to Africa over a period of 6 years to $120 billion. Analysts say it's a massive boost for the continent.
The Chinese leadership has focused a lot of resources to support African economies to expand their consumption capacity, to support infrastructure development. We've seen a lot of investment by the Chinese in infrastructure in Africa, across Africa. And this is a further confirmation of the way the Chinese leadership views their partnership with African economies.
60 billion is a very significant amount. It's also important that they are beginning to look at the actual benefits of all those investments. Previously, that conversation as to the specific long-term benefits of those investments were not discussed.
For quite a while, some critics, especially in the West, have accused China of inundating African countries with unsustainable debt burden. But the Chinese president more than answered those critics when he announced that China would write off the debts of poor African nations.
There are countries that have gone through periods of war and strife, countries like South Sudan, Somalia, Liberia, Sierra Leone. And if they are able to get those debts cancelled, then they can now start on a fresh start, a fresh slate where they can develop mutually beneficial relationships.
If you look at the history of Chinese support in Africa, in the past, between 2000 and 2018, the Chinese government has written off or cancelled about 10 billion debt owed by African countries that are very poor. And this additional promise that they will further grant some debt cancellation to poor African countries will go a long way to relieve those countries of the burden of debt service and debt obligations.
So much has been read into the actual intention of China in Africa, with some alleging an ulterior motive, something President Xi strongly denied at this summit, and African leaders themselves have long dispelled that.
What China is doing is to support the expansion of consumption in Africa, so that Africa will remain a strong trading partner for China. I do not imagine that to be a great gift. The basic thing is that if economies in Africa expand, if per capita income increase, then African economies, African consumers will actually also expand their consumption capacity. And China is looking for an export market. So China is looking for trading partners.
Perhaps the most defining outcome of this year's FOCAC summit is unveiling of the 8 major initiatives the Chinese president says China will implement with African countries in the next 3 years and beyond.
Under the framework of the 10 major cooperation plans, China will work closely with African countries and implement 8 major initiatives in the next 3 years and beyond. In fields like industrial acceleration, infrastructure connectivity, trade facilitation, green development, capacity building, healthcare, people-to-people exchanges, and peace and security.
The future certainly looks bright for relations between Africa and China. And if the outcome of this FOCAC summit is implemented to the latter, then the landscape across this continent would definitely change for the better. And China would have significantly propped up an important partner in progress. Deji Badmo, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Egyptian analyst Dr. Mohammed Farahat has described the summit as an effective way of building the concept of a shared future. Launched by Chinese President Xi Jinping, the concept is the core of China's foreign policy.
I understand that the significance of this concept for Africa is that it's fully in line with the needs of African countries for economic development. China's infrastructure construction, providing real development assistance, loans and encouraging Chinese companies to invest in African countries and regions are real practices in building the community of human destiny and a truly effective response to the need of African countries.
Meanwhile, political analysts in Senegal and Burkina Faso have also applauded China's commitment to sustainable development in Africa.
On ne peut qu'applaudir par rapport à ce discours engagé et très responsable.
We applaud Chinese President Xi Jinping's engaging speech, given that in this time of crisis, Africa really needs a strong and committed partner like China. What is special about the Sino-African relationship is that China does not impose any conditions. Since 1960, Senegal has been working very closely with countries like France, but we have yet to see conclusive results. This speech by President Xi Jinping is a good one and shows that things are moving forward in the economic sector and in other sectors. And this shows us that in reality, it's not only the United States, it's not only the Western countries that are able to gather around in summits like the G7 or the G8. Today we have China, which is a part of the major world powers, and this great country is still supporting Africa.
Parmi ces principes, on retient, et le président l'a rappelé, la non-ingérence.
In general, Chinese policy is friendly to Africa. That is the non-interference in the state's internal affairs, the non-imposition of an economic model. I think China is consistent on this issue. This cooperation with China is a unique historical opportunity for Africa. When you look at the level of commitment, it's practically a Marshall Plan. Again, considering the last peak from which it came in at $60 billion over 3 years. So the arrival of the Chinese support, if it is used wisely in Africa, maybe in 20 or 30 years, they will be able to manage without any help. Since this aid is disconnected from political issues, from my point of view, this gives states enough room for maneuver to carry out their development policy.
China's relationship with Africa also extends to education. In Somalia, the Chinese embassy recently awarded scholarships to scores of top-performing students. They're set to study medicine, engineering and other degrees at universities across China. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo caught up with some of them and filed this report.
41 students from top schools in Somalia have been awarded with scholarship opportunities by the Chinese government to study in some of the top universities in China. Government officials and diplomats from the Chinese embassy in Mogadishu flagged off the students at a colorful ceremony held in Mogadishu. The learning opportunities were awarded to top students who did well in the 2017 national examinations carried out in all of the country's 6 regional states, including Mogadishu.
This year is of special importance to China-Africa and China-Somalia relations. A new chapter of China-Somalia friendship has been opened. We have full confidence in its future. In 2015, there were altogether 1,320 Somali students in China, including 140 supported by Chinese government scholarships.
For these students, studying in China was always their dream. Abdelkader Abdullahi wants to be a medical doctor in the near future. He was awarded the scholarship after emerging as the top student in 2017. He will now spend 6 years in China before becoming a professional doctor.
I am going to study at a university in Shanghai, China. I will begin my studies in medicine from 2018 to 2024 and return back home to make a difference as a professional doctor.
The scholarships are part of the ongoing investment China is making in African education.
I am grateful for this opportunity to study in China. I am also looking forward to learning Mandarin language and having a great time studying abroad.
We're grateful as a government that you are on the path to realizing your full potential. Your parents are happy that you will benefit them after completing your studies abroad. This is a golden opportunity, and you should all make good use of this educational scholarship.
China is among Somalia's key development partners. Earlier this week, the Somali president met with his Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the just concluded FOCAC summit, where Somalia signed a memorandum of understanding with China to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Somalia is also seeking to benefit from the $60 billion pledge made for the continent by the Chinese President Xi Jinping earlier this week in Beijing. It's also seeking China's support in various fields, including economic and technical cooperation, as the Horn of African nation slowly rebuilds after years of conflict. Mogadishu also hopes that Beijing will assist in the restoration of major landmarks, including the biggest national stadium and the country's national theatre that were among the key Chinese projects badly ruined during the years of conflict. Abdulaziz Bilon, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Meanwhile, on Wednesday, a number of Chinese journalists and Chinese workers were briefly detained during a raid by Kenyan police in Nairobi. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has responded to the incident.
The Kenyan police carried out a raid on illegal foreign workers on September the 5th, in which they took away several Chinese journalists and staff members of Chinese invested organizations who have legal documents. After learning this situation, the Chinese embassy in Kenya immediately lodged representation with the Kenyan leadership and all the involved people who have been released on that day. The Kenyan side apologized to China for its improper law enforcement behavior and promised to strengthen management of its grassroots police officers, as well as law enforcement norms and etiquette, to avoid a recurrence of such an incident. We have learned that this raid was part of the Kenya police's operation to crack down on illegal immigrants. It is not targeting or limited to Chinese nationals. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also wants to avail itself of this opportunity to alert Chinese nationals overseas to properly go through legal procedures for their local business and residence in strict accordance with laws and regulations.
Zimbabwe